Tonight's case begins with a chilling one-line note in Archie Goodwin's mail slot that drags Nero Wolfe and Saul Panzer into a deadly game of stolen identities and counterfeit lives. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? And subscribe so you never miss upcoming mysteries. Nero Wolfe and the letter from Saul Panzer. The morning Saul Panzer broke his own commandment started out ordinary enough to fool a saint, and I've never been accused of wearing a halo. At 11 o'clock sharp, because the humidity had declared war at 10, I swung back into the brownstone after a stroll meant to clear my head and found something that did the opposite. My personal mail slot had sprouted a new arrival, a thin, anonymous envelope perched crookedly as if it had been shoved in by someone in a hurry or someone who didn't want to be caught performing the shove. That alone wasn't enough to turn my spine into a piano wire. What did it was the handwriting. Saul Panzer's handwriting isn't something you mistake. He prints like a compass, square, precise, every line marching in formation. Seeing his script on an unmarked envelope in my mail slot was like finding a fingerprint at a séance. Saul doesn't put things in my box, ever. If he wants me to have something, he brings it himself, in person, with that quiet nod that passes for his version of a sonnet. I slit the envelope with my thumb. One sheet, typewritten, unsigned. One line. If this reaches you, I've failed. The paper smelled faintly of metal polish, the kind janitors use on elevator rails or locker hinges. The kind of smell Saul avoids like germs. My stomach pulled a trick I didn't appreciate. I walked fast enough that Fritz, dusting the dining room doorway, raised an eyebrow at my pace and barreled into Wolfe's office. He was at his desk with a plate of corned beef hash, contemplating it with more affection than he'd show most heads of state. The room's big globe lamp cast a golden wash across his face, which carried the serene patience of a man in no hurry to join the rest of humanity in their daily stampede. That calm made my pulse pound louder. "Boss," I said, holding up the sheet like a subpoena, "we've got a problem." Wolfe grunted, a low, warning rumble that meant I should speak before he decided the interruption unworthy of his digestion. So I read it aloud. The last syllable barely left my mouth before Wolfe's fork froze mid-air. His eyes narrowed, glowing the way they do when something touches one of the tiny handful of people he'd bother saving from a burning building. Saul Panzer was on that short list. Wolfe set his fork down as though it had personally betrayed him. Explain the circumstances. It was in my mail slot, no return name. Saul doesn't drop messages, he delivers them. "That," Wolfe said grimly, "is incontrovertible." I could feel the air charge up. Wolfe didn't raise his voice or pound the desk, but the tension leaking from him made it clear that something had jabbed him exactly in the spot he likes least, where his dependables live. Archie Goodwin and Saul Panzer constitute his entire field department, and even Wolfe's considerable ego knows it. "Let me get my coat," I said. "If Saul's in trouble—" "No." Wolfe lifted one imperious finger. "Not until the facts are made coherent. Sit." I hesitated, but Wolfe's tone brooked no argument. Still, I wasn't about to sit down quietly. Saul doesn't send distress notes. He doesn't even sneeze unless he has a plan B ready. Something's wrong. "Undoubtedly," Wolfe's voice gained a soft metallic layer. "But haste is the enemy of reason. You would do well to avoid being its confederate." I wanted to throw something, preferably one of his big leather-bound volumes on ancient legal codes. Instead, I paced, because pacing is sanctioned in the brownstone as long as you don't knock into the globe or the beer tray. "He says, if this reaches you, I've failed." "Failed what?" "That," Wolfe murmured, "is the question I intend to answer." He shifted his bulk toward the phone, which is the Wolfe equivalent of running an Olympic sprint. "Mr. Cohen," he said, when Lon picked up on the Gazette line, "inform me if your staff has encountered Mr. Panzer today." Then he hung up and immediately buzzed Kramer. That made me stop pacing. Wolfe doesn't summon Inspector Kramer before lunch unless the world is ending, or he wants someone to think it is. Kramer's voice came on tight and short. I could hear the gears turning. "Saul Panzer? What about him?" Wolfe gave the bare bones. Kramer didn't swear, rare enough, but he did exhale like someone had punched his badge. "Saul contacted homicide 48 hours ago about a man he was shadowing. Wouldn't give details yet. I'll find out who he spoke to. Sit tight." When Wolfe hung up, I tried again. "Let me go look around. Check Saul's usual circuits. Park Row, that jobber's office on 46th, the locksmith. You may go, Wolfe said, with theatrical reluctance, but not to flail. Trace, do not thrash. His eyes softened almost imperceptibly. Archie. Which meant he really was worried. I tapped the note. If Saul's been grabbed, someone wants you rattled. Pfui. Wolfe clicked his tongue. Intimidation is wasted on me, but Mr. Panzer is not. There was the protectiveness again, buried under 2 tons of bluster and vocabulary. I left immediately, inhaling the swampy Manhattan air like it might give me an answer. Saul's world is the underbelly of legitimate business. Messenger depots, jobbers' offices, delivery routes, the spaces people use to move information they don't want fingerprinted. I started with the Gazette since Lon could always be counted on to supply chatter along with the latest headline. Lon leaned back in his chair, chewing the end of a pencil. Haven't seen Saul today, Arch, but I heard a weird bit this morning. Some runner said he watched a guy who looked like Saul arguing with a tall man in a grey suit outside a mail drop on 12th. Arguing how? Like one of them owed the other money or an apology. That didn't sound like Saul. He collects information, not quarrels. Still, it was a direction. I hit the mail drop. The owner, a thin, nervous woman with the kind of eyes that blink twice before answering anything, recognized Saul immediately. He came yesterday evening, picked up a sealed packet. Then this tall fellow, grey suit, sharp face, followed him out. They exchanged words. The tall man shoved him. Saul didn't shove back. Saul never shoves back unless it's step 3 in a plan, I said. What else? He asked me for a photostat of a client card. Unusual for him. That was something. Saul doesn't leave trails unless he wants someone to follow. Outside, the humidity had teeth. I found myself thinking about Saul's careful habits, his way of appearing and disappearing like a well-bred ghost. The kind of man who could tail you across 5 boroughs without ever stepping in the same patch of light twice. If he left a hint behind, it wasn't by accident. I returned to the brownstone and found Wolfe in the office, glowering at the now cold corned beef hash, like it had taken a personal vow to offend him. Report, he snapped. That was another indicator of alarm. Wolfe usually begins interrogations with philosophical meanderings. Skipping straight to business meant his nerves were grinding. I summarized: mail drop confrontation, photostat request, grey-suited shadow. Wolfe absorbed every word with the solemnity of a judge at sentencing. There is a substructure, he murmured. Something beneath these gestures. Yeah, I said, it's called trouble, and Saul's wearing it. Before Wolfe could reply, the doorbell rang. I moved to get it, but Wolfe barked, "One moment." His tone wasn't angry. It was taut, almost anticipatory. He was right to be. A messenger stood at the door holding an envelope identical to the first, same cream paper and type. Back in the office, I slit it open. Same typewritten line, no signature, but this time it was addressed to Nero Wolfe. Nero Wolfe. I held it out. Wolfe stared at it as if the envelope itself offered insult. His nostrils flared. Archie. Yeah? Lock the front door, return immediately. I did. When I came back, Wolfe had drawn himself up behind his desk with a stillness that made the room shrink. They have escalated, he said softly. Who's they? That, Wolfe said. You will find out. You will go out again. Start with Mr. Cohen, then the depots. But Archie... He stopped. Be careful. I would not have 2 men of mine imperiled in one day. That was Wolfe being protective. He hated saying it, but he said it. I nodded. I'll bring back something useful. You had better. Mr. Panzer depends on it. And that's how the trouble really began. 1 letter for me, 1 for Wolfe, and the unmistakable feeling that Saul Panzer was somewhere in Manhattan, fighting a battle he wasn't supposed to fight alone. The kind of heat that Manhattan cooks up in July is the democratic sort. It roasts newsboys, bankers, and private eyes in one communal skillet. And by the time I hit Park Row to retrace Saul's footsteps, the sidewalk felt like a griddle auditioning for Fritz's kitchen. I don't usually complain out loud to the pavement, but that morning earned an exception. Saul Panzer had left a trail so faint it could have been written on cigarette smoke, and it was my cheerful task to follow it as if I were an eager bloodhound with impeccable table manners. Wolfe would have phrased it more delicately, naturally, But the reality was the same. Saul had vanished. The letter smelled like doom with a side of metal polish, and someone had the gall to send a second missive addressed to Wolfe himself. That wasn't just trouble, that was choreography. The financial printer on Park Row was my first stop. The building smelled of ink, paper dust, and overheated ambition. A counter clerk with spectacles shaped like frying pans told me Saul had been in 2 days prior to check on a job for an unnamed client. He didn't recall Saul looking distressed, which meant either Saul had been fine or the clerk wouldn't notice distress if it tap-danced in a tutu. As a red herring, it was serviceable but bland. Saul rarely wasted minutes, and he certainly wouldn't burn daylight visiting printers unless something about the job mattered. I filed it mentally and headed out. Next, West 46th Street. The locksmith's shop was a long, narrow cave of brass shavings and sarcasm. The proprietor, a wiry man who looked like he'd been carved out of a file cabinet, leaned over the counter with an expert squint. "Saul? Sure, he was in here. Needed a file on a skeleton key. Didn't say why." "Did he look roughed up?" I asked. "Saul Panzer?" The locksmith barked a laugh. "Son, if you see a man who looks like he roughed up Saul Panzer, call me. We'll split the reward for finding Bigfoot." That was almost comforting, except Saul had left a distressed note, and even legends can get clipped by the wrong set of hands. I bought a soda from a corner stand and drank half of it, while watching elevated trains groan overhead, like they were dragging the city's sins behind them. Heat shimmered off the street. My collar wilted in self-defense. Then came Hell's Kitchen, the private mail drop squarely at the intersection of Suspicious Avenue and Trouble Boulevard. The owner was the same jittery 30-something woman who'd spoken to me before, but this time her nerves hopped like they'd gotten into the espresso jar. "You again?" she murmured, twisting a pencil. "Did you find your friend?" "Working on it," I said. "Start with last night. You said he came in to pick up a sealed packet." She nodded. It was waiting for him. He checked it, said nothing, and walked out. Her eyes darted to the door. But then the other man followed. Tall, grey suit, rough hands. They argued right outside. I watched through the glass. "What kind of argument?" "One-sided," she whispered. "The tall man shoved him, hard, and when your friend came back inside to ask for a photostat of the address card, he had a bruise coming up on his cheek." Saul Panzer. Bruised. That was like hearing Mount Rushmore got a nosebleed. "Describe the tall guy." Sharp jaw, cold stare, a suit that fit too well for the neighborhood. She hesitated. "He paid for a locker key last week, used it once, and left in a hurry." I kept my tone casual. "Saul ever ask you for a photostat before?" "Never," she said without blinking. So Saul had wanted a paper trail. Very unlike him. Either he was tracking someone or someone was tracking him, and he needed evidence tucked someplace safe. I thanked her and stepped outside into heat that slapped like a Broadway critic. My mind ran loops. Saul's cheek bruised, a tall grey suit, a sealed packet, a photostat, and a letter that read like a goodbye note written under duress. If there was a pattern, it hadn't introduced itself politely yet. By the time I reached the brownstone again, the humidity had given my shirt the texture of damp laundry. Fritz spotted me entering and delivered a silent headshake filled with European disapproval, either for returning sweaty or for existing in the first place. In the office, Wolfe sat behind his desk, with the posture of a judge whose patience for human foolishness had expired right before lunch. "Well?" he demanded. I delivered my report from start to finish, pausing only when Wolfe's nostrils flared at a detail he disliked. He sat with fingertips pressed together, eyelids half lowered like a man listening to a faint overture on the world's smallest radio. "The bruise is significant," he pronounced. "Sure," I said. "Saul taking a punch is like seeing Theodore misplace an orchid pin. If it happens, the universe is cracked." Wolfe opened his eyes fully and glared. "Your levity is untimely." "Maybe, but it keeps the air moving. What do you make of the photostat?" He frowned. "It implies intent. Mr. Panzer anticipated danger. He never leaves records behind without motive." "You're worried," I prodded, just because needling Wolfe occasionally helps the digestion. He shot me a look that could curdle coffee. "I am concerned, Archie, not incapacitated." But his tone, cool, clipped and thinner around the edges, betrayed the worry he'd never admit to strangers. Before I could comment, Fritz appeared silently in the doorway to announce lunch. The aroma of Fritz's onion soup drifted in like a peace offering from a higher plane. Wolfe checked the clock. It was 12:58, and refused beer, which proved he was rattled. The world could have ended at that moment, and Wolfe would still wait until 1 minute past noon to let beer cross his lips. But lunch at 1 was sacrosanct. During lunch, which Wolfe barely acknowledged, I teased him once about considering skipping a meal in Saul's honour. Wolfe replied with a growl so dignified it belonged in a music hall. "Archie, to forego sustenance is to forego thought." "Sure," I said, "but I've seen you think just fine while chewing." After lunch we returned to the office. Wolfe settled into his chair with a sigh that suggested the world had failed to arrange itself satisfactorily. "Call Mr. Cohen," he ordered. "Ascertain whether he has discovered anything about this tall man." I dialed Lon Cohen at the Gazette. His voice came fuzzed with newsroom chaos. "Archie, you're in luck, or out of it. There's talk that Aldous Peck resurfaced last week. A real snake. He hires freelancers for jobs with too many shadows." "Saul ever work for him?" "Not officially, but there was chatter. Peck pays well, and badly." I covered the receiver. "Peck," I said to Wolfe, "our favourite ghost of corporate espionage." Wolfe muttered something French and unflattering. Then, at 2:11 by the office clock, the phone rang again. Wolfe answered. His face changed. Not a lot, but enough. "Yes, Inspector," Wolfe said. Kramer's voice rumbled faintly from the earpiece. Clipped, taut, all gravel, no cigar stubs. Wolfe listened in perfect silence. Then, "I see. Yes, we shall expect word." He hung up with a gravity that tied the air into knots. "So," I said. "A body has been found," Wolfe announced, "in a derelict office near 9th Avenue. Saul? The clothing matches Mr. Panzer's." It felt like someone had set my ribs in a vice. "That," Wolfe added, eyes narrowing, "is all Inspector Kramer will say, for now." Which meant the scene wasn't closed and the identification wasn't complete, but the words hung there between us like a lead weight. I turned for the door. Wolfe's voice stopped me, firm, quiet. "Archie, do not. I have to." He shut his eyes once, briefly. "Then be careful." And that was all the permission I needed. I grabbed my hat, pushed out into the Manhattan furnace and headed straight for 9th Avenue, toward a corpse dressed like Saul Panzer, and the ugly possibility waiting beside it. If there's one thing Manhattan does well, it's furnish a grim backdrop for bad news, and 9th Avenue that afternoon looked like it had dressed especially for the occasion. The sky hung low, the air sagged like tired laundry, and the derelict office building Pearlie Stebbins had commandeered as a makeshift morgue had all the charm of a busted tooth. I pushed through the doorway with a stomach full of resentment and a pocket full of hope, and the hope wasn't winning. Stebbins met me halfway down the dim, peeling corridor. For once, the bulldog expression was dialed down to something almost respectful. "Goodwin," he grunted. "Wolfe send you?" "Unless you think I developed a sudden hobby in sightseeing corpse dens," I said. Humour keeps the oxygen flowing. Pearlie's jaw tightened, but he didn't bite. "It's bad," he said, leading me into the room. "Looks like your boy Panzer." I didn't answer. I couldn't, not until I saw for myself. The room was a stripped-down office. Rusted file cabinets, bare floorboards, a desk pushed against the wall like it was ashamed of being there. The body lay face down beside an overturned chair. Same suit Saul favoured, same flat cap style he wore like a signature. For a second the world narrowed, and then Pearlie bent, got a grip under the shoulder, and rolled the body over. Not Saul. The breath I'd been refusing finally came, a jagged thing that scraped my ribs on the way out. The man was older, hair dyed a shade Saul wouldn't touch with rubber gloves, and a faded scar dragged from his jawline to the ear. He might have passed for Saul if the lighting was bad and the viewer had recently sustained a concussion, but not in any honest sense. Pearlie watched my reaction, then nodded. "Yeah, that's what I thought. But look at this." He reached into the dead man's inner pocket and pulled out a photostat. He handed it to me like something fragile. It was perfectly crisp. Saul Panzer's investigator license. Not counterfeit. Real. Someone had lifted it from Saul and planted it on this decoy. I exhaled slowly. "If someone wanted Wolfe rattled," I said, "congratulations. They found the right lever." Pearlie's mouth twitched. That's as close as he gets to agreement. "We're running the prints," he said, "but the place was scrubbed. Whoever set this up knew what he was doing." "Yeah," I said. "He did everything but gift wrap it." I crouched near the body, careful not to touch anything that would earn me Kramer's wrath. The man's hands were calloused, the nails stained faintly with ink. Not Saul's hands. Saul's hands are neat, even when he's been tailing someone for 3 days straight. This guy looked like he'd been printing half his life. A red herring popped up when I spotted a smudge on the collar, something dark, maybe grease. For a moment I wondered if Saul had been in a scuffle here after all, but a closer look killed that. Wrong pattern, wrong height. Pearlie cleared his throat. "You want to tell Wolfe anything else?" "Just the obvious," I said, rising. "Someone wants us chasing the wrong ghost." He nodded and let me go without the usual sermon. That alone proved how much respect the department had for Saul Panzer. Even Pearlie Stebbins knew when to shut up. Back at the brownstone, the air felt cooler, cleaner, like I'd entered a different planet. Wolfe was at his desk, the afternoon sun turning the office golden. He looked up, face carved from granite. "Well?" he demanded. "It's not Saul," I said. Wolfe's shoulders dropped a fraction, so small no civilian would notice. "But someone wants us to think it is. They dressed a corpse in Saul's clothes and planted his license on him." Wolfe's growl vibrated the bookshelves. "Impudence, insolence, a vicious charade." "Also effective," I said. "Whoever staged it probably counted on you freezing up." His eyes snapped to me. "Archie." "Yes, fine, you don't freeze, you merely simmer." "That will do." But something softened in his tone. Protectiveness. Quiet, but there. I filled him in on every detail. Wolfe's questions came fast, sharp, surgical. He was building a mental blueprint brick by brick. When I speculated, he cut me off with a glare. "Do not infer beyond your evidence." "Some of us," I said, "have to gather evidence without the benefit of furniture roots." That earned me a thin-lipped expression halfway between offence and reluctant acknowledgement. "Your fieldwork," he muttered, "is occasionally adequate," which, translated from Wolfe speak, was a standing ovation. At 4:03 p.m., right as Wolfe's orchid hours technically resumed, the doorbell rang. I got it. Inspector Kramer pushed in like a steam engine running on anger and nicotine. He looked tired. Not mad. Tired. "Wolfe?" He nodded, then handed over a manila envelope. "Certified copies of everything on the stiff. You get the originals? Not a chance, you get these." Wolfe accepted them with a curt nod. "My thanks, Inspector." Kramer blinked. Praise from Wolfe always hits like a surprise snowstorm. "Don't thank me yet. We're stretched thin. If this ties into espionage, the feds will cut right through all of us." His cigar twitched as he spoke. I could tell he meant it. No bluster, just duty grinding him down. Kramer started toward the door, then paused. "Wolfe, if Panzer's in this, find him before I have to." That, coming from Kramer, was practically sentiment. Then he left, the door closing behind him with a sigh. I barely had time to breathe before the phone rang. I grabbed it. A man's voice. Distorted. Cold. "Tell Wolfe to stop looking for Saul," it said, "or you'll get the next letter." Click. I stood there holding the dead receiver. Then I turned toward Wolfe. "Boss," I said, "we've got company." And the look Wolfe gave me said the game had changed, and nobody in the brownstone was off the board now. Dinner at the brownstone should be a protected ceremony, like church, but with better ingredients and a higher chance of Wolfe scowling at humanity. On that particular evening, Fritz had outdone himself. Roast duck with citrus glaze perfumed the dining room like a bribe from Olympus. Wolfe was already positioned at the table with the solemn air of a man about to negotiate terms with a deity. I was halfway through appreciating the steam rising from my plate when the doorbell decided to commit sacrilege. At 8:07 p.m., Fritz appeared at the threshold, eyes wide enough to register as a culinary emergency. He never interrupts dinner unless the building is on fire or someone important is. "Mr. Goodwin," he said softly, "there is a man at the door, a messenger." Wolfe groaned, not loudly, but enough. I pushed back from the table. "If this is someone trying to sell fire extinguishers," I said, "I'll toss him off the stoop." At the front door, the messenger handed over a small parcel. No signature required. That alone smelled wrong. The envelope was the same type as the earlier letters, cream paper, neat type, no clues except malice. Back in the dining room, Wolfe stared as I unwrapped it. Inside was Saul's flat cap. Same shape, same faint bend at the brim from years of thoughtful tugging, but smudged, oil, dust, and something darker, metallic. Fritz gasped. Wolfe didn't, but his fork halted mid-air, suspended like a freeze-frame of worry. I held up the cap. Saul never leaves a hat behind unless he expects to come back for it. And Saul wasn't the forgetting type. "Do not," Wolfe rumbled, "leap to conclusions." His baritone held steady, but something underneath it had cracked, maybe an octave lower, maybe a shade tremulous. "Sit. We will proceed rationally." I sat, because Wolfe's version of protectiveness usually comes wrapped in insults and delivered with perfect posture. He hated showing it, but when Saul Panzer was involved, Wolfe's equilibrium bent. He dabbed his lips with a napkin. "Archie, my desk, a pad. You will take dictation." I fetched the pad from the office, resisting the urge to sniff Saul's hat again, not because I thought it would tell me much, but because I wanted to confirm it existed in my hands, and not in some waking nightmare. Wolfe dictated 10 names, Saul's most recent clients pulled from Wolfe's memory like files from a steel drawer. I called each in order. Client number 1, out of town, in Boston on business. Client number 2, caught a train to Philadelphia that morning. Client number 3, refused to speak, claiming attorney privilege where none applied. Client number 4, hung up so fast the click stung. Client number 5, bingo. The 5th client, a jittery import office accountant, spilled enough under my firm yet charming tone to tell me Saul had been investigating a counterfeiting ring, corporate courier routes, forged identifications, cash transfers that moved through Midtown like whispers. The kind of racket where a man like Saul could make enemies by blinking too loudly. I relayed everything. Wolfe absorbed it silently, his eyes narrowing until they were 2 amber slits. A motif was forming. Couriers, hidden messages, false papers, stolen reputations. Then the phone rang. I was closest, so I grabbed it. "Nero Wolfe's residence." Kramer's voice rasped through the receiver like sandpaper on a radiator. "Goodwin? Put Wolfe on." I handed it over. Wolfe listened in that heavy, unblinking way of his. No grunts, no questions, which meant Kramer was stating facts and Wolfe didn't like them. When he hung up, Wolfe's fingers lingered on the receiver longer than they should have. "Well?" I asked. "The corpse," Wolfe said, "has been identified. A petty grifter, known associate of Aldous Peck." That tightened the screws. Peck was the name Lon Cohen had floated earlier, the shadowy broker who hired men to deliver trouble and pick up regret. "That ties him to the bruiser in the grey suit," I said, and the mail drop. Wolfe lifted the cap from the table with a slow, deliberate motion. "This," he said quietly, "is not a threat. It is a proclamation." I raised an eyebrow. "Meaning?" "Meaning the men who hold Mr. Panzer wish to display their reach and their confidence." I didn't like the sound of that. "So, what's the next move?" Wolfe inhaled deeply, a full-lung pre-decision breath. He pushed his chair back, planted both hands on the arms, and rose with the solemnity of a judge delivering a life sentence. "Bring Mr. Kramer here," he thundered. It wasn't a request, it wasn't even a command. It was the verbal equivalent of locking the city in a vice. "Immediately," Wolfe added. Something in Saul's hat, something in the dirt, the oil, the way it had been delivered, had convinced Wolfe that whatever line had been crossed before, the enemy had just crossed another. I grabbed the phone, pulse kicking up another notch. Dinner was forgotten. The hunt had begun. If Inspector Kramer has a spectrum of scowls, the one he wore that day was the professional courtesy version, the kind he brings to the brownstone when the world is falling apart, but protocol requires him to pretend it isn't. Later that evening, Fritz appeared silently in the doorway to announce him, and Kramer stomped in with his fedora under one arm and his cigar clamped tight enough to strangle the flavour out of it. Wolfe didn't rise, naturally, but he did incline his head with a gravity that counted as a handshake in Wolfland. On Wolfe's desk lay the 3 letters, Saul's hat, and the photostat from the decoy corpse, evidence arranged like an indictment ready to be read aloud. Kramer sniffed the air. Fritz had baked something with rosemary, which probably offended the cigar, but his attention snapped to the items on Wolfe's blotter. "All right," he grunted. "Let's have it." Wolfe gestured at the hat. "Inspector, someone is using Mr. Panzer as leverage against me. The body you found was planted to misdirect. These letters," he tapped them one by one, "are calculated to provoke haste and error." Kramer lifted an eyebrow. "You? Make an error?" Wolfe's voice went frosty. "Even I am not immune to concern when a trusted operative is imperiled." I couldn't resist. "Saul's a lot of things, Inspector, but I wouldn't call him a bloodhound. More a chess player who walks." Kramer's mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was as close as his face had evolved to manage. He cleared his throat. "We got an anonymous call late last night. One of my men took it. A guy said he was holding a famous detective's best bloodhound. Wouldn't name who, wouldn't name where." Wolfe's eyelids flickered. "Saul." "Yeah." Kramer dug out a notebook. "We ran the voice through every filter we've got. Nothing. No match, no clue, no background noise except maybe machinery. Could be a warehouse, could be a boiler room, could be the guy's stomach." Wolfe exhaled through his nose. "Unsatisfactory." "Join the club," Kramer said, and then fixed Wolfe with a look sharp enough to puncture a lesser man. "If you know something about Peck, anything, we need it." Wolfe snapped. "I require access to Peck's known associates. A full list." Kramer bristled but didn't erupt. "You keep me updated, no surprises, and I'll get you the list. You pull another stunt like the tax exemption fiasco." Wolfe waved a hand. "Spare me ancient grievances." They stared at each other like two chess pieces debating who moved first. Then Kramer grumbled, "Fine, I'll get the list." And that was the bargain. My next errand took me into a part of Manhattan that advertises itself with peeling paint and the smell of aimless ambition. A billiards lounge on 39th, home base for investigators for hire, grifters, and men who kept secrets in their jacket linings. Inside, the haze was so thick it had texture. A jittery kid with eyes too large for his skull recognized Saul's name and motioned me over. "Peck? Yeah. He's been around. Real nervous these days. Bought himself a duplicator, one of those fancy stencil rigs. Good for government passes." That matched the courier motif forming in the case. Paperwork that didn't belong to the people carrying it. Roots that shouldn't exist. The kid leaned closer. "People say he hired someone to shadow Panzer. 3 days. Tall guy. Grey suit." Saul shadowed. The universe was slipping out of alignment. I dropped him a bill and headed back uptown. When I entered the brownstone, the office was a picture out of a botany-themed courtroom drama. Wolfe sat behind his desk while Theodore Horstman stood beside him with the posture of a man delivering autopsy results for flowers. On the desk, Saul's hat. Under Wolfe's magnifying glass, flecks of yellowish pollen. Theodore cleared his throat. "Not from our plant rooms, Mr. Wolfe. This came from an outside source, a greenhouse or florist specializing in rare hybrids." Wolfe nodded once gravely. "Thank you, Theodore." Theodore retreated with the air of a monk exiting confession. I set my hat down. "So Saul was near an orchid grower not on our approved list? Shocking. Shall I alert the pulpit?" "Archie," Wolfe said, voice taut, "the pollen is a location marker, and an unexpected one." His gaze narrowed. "Report." I told him everything from the billiards hall. Wolfe listened, absorbing details like they were calories. When I mentioned the duplicator, his eyebrows climbed half an inch. When I mentioned Saul being shadowed, they climbed another. "Identity theft," Wolfe murmured. "Replacement. Substitution." "Comforting words," I said. "Anything less cheery you'd like to add?" He ignored that. "A duplicating machine could produce forged federal passes. This ties Peck more tightly to the corpse." Before I could answer, the phone rang, short, sharp, urgent. I grabbed it. "Nero Wolfe's, Archie." Saul Panzer's voice, hoarse, frayed. "Tell." A struggle, a grunt, something heavy, the scrape of a receiver shifting. "Saul!" I shouted. "Where are you?" A hiss, a breath, and the line went dead. Slowly, with all the force of a landslide postponed, I turned. Wolfe had risen half an inch out of his chair, a rare involuntary movement. His face was white with fury and fear. The orchids, dinner, ritual, it all vanished behind that look. Saul Panzer was alive, and someone had just told us so by accident. If Wolfe has a gear beyond immovable object, I saw it that afternoon, The moment Saul's strangled call died in our ears. His mass didn't leave the chair, but something inside him lunged. He gripped the armrests as if steadying the brownstone itself. "Archie," he said, voice low and metallic. "Fetch Theodore. At once." 2 minutes later, Theodore Horstman appeared with Saul's hat cupped like contraband. Under Wolfe's magnifying lamp, the pollen smeared across the brim looked almost golden. "Not ours," Theodore said. "This variety is a rare hybrid, imported by only one dealer in Manhattan, Vito Marani." Wolfe's eyes narrowed. Marani, the florist with pretensions. I pulled on my hat. "I'll go ask him about his pretensions." "Proceed with caution," Wolfe murmured, and though he said it like a commandment, it landed like concern. Marani's shop perched on a midtown corner with more velvet drapery than a minor European monarchy. The bell jingled as I stepped inside, and the scent of orchids hit me with the force of a polite punch. Vito Marani emerged from the back room wearing a tie more expensive than my suit and hands too smooth for anyone claiming to wrangle soil. "Ah," he purred, "a gentleman seeking elegance?" "Something like that," I said. "I'm ordering flowers for a friend. He doesn't like them unless they come with extortion notes. Very particular taste." Marani blinked. Just once, but it was enough. "I'm afraid we don't offer that service." "Funny," I said, "because a client of yours might, Aldous Peck." The tie twitched. "I deal in arrangements, Mr. Goodwin," I said. "Archie Goodwin, and I like answers arranged neatly." He sighed in the tragic manner of a man forced to disclose inconvenient truths. "Peck did procure a special order 2 nights ago, and he requested use of my private room." "Soundproofed?" I asked. Marani hesitated, which was confirmation. He led me to the back, through velvet curtains, past display orchids preening like debutantes, into a narrow corridor. The door to the private room was heavy, reinforced, too professional for a florist's casual needs. Inside, the air was thick with wilted petals and stale tobacco. I scanned quickly. Scuff marks dug into the floorboards. Drag marks. A cigarette stub lay near the wall. I stooped and studied it. Wrong brand for Saul. He loathes Turkish blend. So someone else had waited in here, watched in here. Then I saw it. A scrap of paper, half crushed beneath a crate. Torn irregularly. Saul's handwriting. Square, precise, unmistakable. "Wolfe, don't trust." The rest severed. My throat tightened. I slipped it into a notepad, careful not to smudge it. This was not police evidence, not yet, but it was Saul evidence which to Wolfe ranked higher. "Mr. Marani," I said, "if you've left out anything, now's the time." He spread his soft hands. Peck was frightened. He met someone both nights. I heard raised voices, Peck begging almost. The other man stayed silent. "Describe him." "I never saw him." That was a red herring, but not a useless one. There's a special pitch in a man's voice when he lies out of fear, and Marani had just hit it. Back at the brownstone, the office felt tighter, as if the walls had leaned in to eavesdrop. Wolfe sat rigid, hands steepled, expression carved from basalt. I placed the scrap of paper on his blotter. He stared at it, long and silent. Then he spoke, voice softened by something I rarely heard, grief tied to resolve. "Saul Panzer is not given to betrayal, Mr. Goodwin. He is given to courage." I sat. "He was trying to warn you about Peck, or whoever Peck is scared of." Wolfe closed his eyes briefly. "I had hoped—" He didn't finish the sentence. Before I could answer, the phone rang. Wolfe gestured. I picked up. "Yes?" Kramer's voice, taut, clipped, worn. "Goodwin. Peck's gone. Pulled a disappearing act. 3 offices cleared out. Apartment empty. Neighbors say he left with a suitcase and a man who wasn't him." "A hostage?" I asked. "That's the working theory." A pause. "Your boy Panzer may still be alive, but not for long if we don't move." Wolfe leaned forward. "Inspector," he said, pitching his voice so Kramer couldn't miss the weight behind it, "if you find anything at all, you will inform me immediately." Kramer didn't argue. That alone told me how deep this was sinking. He hung up. The office filled with a silence so thick Fritz would have needed a carving knife. Wolfe slid the scrap of Saul's handwriting closer, studying the torn edge as though he could reconstruct the missing warning through sheer will. It implies, he said, a third player. Someone above Peck, I asked. Someone behind him, Wolfe corrected. Before I could pursue that, a knock sounded at the door. 3 rapid taps, urgent but controlled. Fritz appeared at the office threshold, his face pale with alarm. "Mr. Wolfe, a visitor. He insists on seeing you." "Who is it?" Wolfe demanded. Fritz swallowed. "Aldous Peck." That landed like a sledgehammer. "Show him in," Wolfe said. But Fritz didn't move. "He says," Fritz added, voice trembling, "that someone far more dangerous has Mr. Panzer, and that he must beg you for refuge." The room went still. Saul's note lay between us, half a sentence, half a warning, and now the man who set the trap had come to Wolfe's door. A man doesn't usually burst into the brownstone begging for refuge unless he's either guilty, terrified, or rehearsing for a charity melodrama. Aldous Peck managed to look like all 3 as Fritz ushered him into the office. His suit was expensive but wrinkled, his hair slicked back with enough pomade to waterproof a canoe, and his eyes darted around like he expected an assassin to pop out from behind Wolfe's dictionary stand. Wolfe didn't rise, naturally, but his eyebrows did. "Mr. Peck," he said, voice crisp as cold steel, "your sudden desire for sanctuary is noteworthy." Peck swallowed hard. I had to come here. They're after me, all of them, and they have Panzer." Archie Goodwin, me, leaned against Wolfe's desk. "Start with the part where you explain why Saul Panzer would get mixed up with you without disinfecting the idea first." Peck shot me a wounded look. "He wasn't my enemy. He was my investigator." Wolfe's fingers drummed once on the arm of his chair. "Explain, briefly, with coherence." Peck nodded rapidly, hands twisting. "There's someone infiltrating freelance investigators, stealing their credentials, their roots, their clients, taking their identities, temporarily or permanently. A professional impersonator with a very specific goal, hijacking established reputations so he can bypass restrictions, courier checkpoints, and secure buildings." "Identity theft," I said. "The healthful, refreshing kind." Peck ignored me. 3 months ago, someone used the credentials of one of my investigators to steal a federal ledger. That's when I hired Panzer. He was the only one good enough to trace the forger without tipping him off." Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "Who is this impersonator?" Peck hesitated. Wolfe's voice dropped a degree. "Spare us theatrics. You came here to speak. Do so." "Martin Greer," Peck whispered. "Former government engraver. Brilliant. Violent. Vanished 5 years ago after a scandal involving counterfeit securities. Everyone thought he fled the country." "Most people," I said, "aren't smart enough to hide in plain sight. Greer sounds like the kind who would." Peck nodded frantically. "He targeted investigators first, quiet ones, people with clean reputations and steady clients. He'd follow them, mimic them, take their work, take their identities. Saul realized Greer had infiltrated my network. And instead of warning us," I said, "you ran." Peck flinched. "He turned on me. I barely escaped. He has muscle, men who do the grabbing and the dumping. Panzer must have gotten too close." Wolfe lifted one hand, palm outward, a gesture that could halt a stampede. "Mr. Peck, your evasions are an offence to grammar and decency. I require clarity." I interrupted with a ginger ale from the side table. "Want one? Helps loosen tongues. Also good for settling guilt." Peck pushed it away. "Greer has a hideout, a printing warehouse in the East 30s, abandoned on paper, fully operational in reality. That's where he keeps the men he steals from. Investigators, couriers, anyone whose identity he needs." "Prisoners," Wolfe said quietly. Peck nodded. "Panzer is one of them now." The room froze for a moment. Even the ticking clock on Wolfe's desk sounded hesitant. Before I could press further, the doorbell rang. Fritz appeared with Inspector Kramer trailing behind him like a tired avalanche. His professional scowl had upgraded to the "I'll cooperate if it kills me" model. Kramer looked at Peck, then at Wolfe. "All right, what have we got?" Wolfe gestured. "Mr. Peck has information regarding Mr. Panzer's abductor." "Greer," Peck squeaked. "Martin Greer." Kramer stiffened. "We've heard whispers. Nothing solid. He's been a ghost for years." Wolfe leaned forward. He is no longer a ghost. He is a parasite, and he holds Saul Panzer. Kramer didn't argue. He simply removed his cigar, tapped ash into Fritz's forbidden vase, and said, "Panzer once helped me clean up a homicide nobody else could straighten. He didn't ask for credit, didn't ask for anything." He swallowed hard, rare emotion from a man whose diet was rage and tobacco. "We'll find him." Peck wrung his hands. "Greer wants me dead. If I give you his location, you will receive no protection here," Wolfe said sharply. "This house is not a sanctuary for cowards." Peck sagged. "I didn't ask for protection. Only anonymity." "That," Wolfe said, "is merely another word for convenience." He lifted a hand. "But you will tell us the address." Peck's voice broke. "East 33rd Street, Old Branning and Sons Printing. They close at 5, officially, but the presses run all night." Kramer scribbled it down, then fired me a look. "Goodwin?" "I'm not allergic to warehouses," I said, "though I prefer ones with fewer kidnappers." Wolfe snapped. "Archie." I turned to him. "You will not," Wolfe said, "enter that warehouse until we have precise intelligence on its interior. I will not have you blundering into a trap." It was protectiveness, pure and unvarnished, wrapped in annoyance to keep it palatable. "Yes, sir," I said. Peck let out a thin breath. "There's more. He's keeping more than one man. Panzer wasn't the first. Greer's been holding investigators for weeks, using them, mimicking them, stealing their work." A cold shudder threaded its way across my spine. "So a whole ring of men are wearing other men's skins." "Exactly," Peck whispered. Kramer closed his notebook. "All right, Wolfe, I'll wait for your report." And with that rare phrase of respect, he was gone. Peck stood trembling in the center of the room. Fritz hovered near the doorway, scandalized by the emotional mess bleeding into the brownstone's polished calm. Wolfe drew a breath, deep and taut. "Archie?" "Yes?" "Prepare for a siege." Because now we knew the name of the man wearing Saul Panzer's shadow, and he wasn't done taking lives he didn't own. The thing about warehouse doors in Manhattan is that they never open quietly. They creak, groan, and complain like overworked stage actors hoping for applause. The one on East 33rd was no exception. As I wedged my shoulder into it at 9:47 a.m., the metal gave way with a screech that probably alerted half the block and any kidnappers inside. Saul Panzer would have rolled his eyes at me. Saul could slip through a locked door without leaving a fingerprint, footprint, or memory. I, Archie Goodwin, left sound effects. Inside, the air hit me first. Ink, oil, damp paper, and the distinctive perfume of criminal enterprise. A printing press hammered away somewhere deeper in the building, its rhythm steady and mechanical, like a heartbeat that had forgotten its original host. I moved through the shadows, eyes adjusting. Presses, rollers, ink drums stacked like metallic soldiers, desks littered with half-finished credentials, government seals in various stages of illegal reproduction. If the Treasury Department ever saw this place, they'd faint dead away. Then I found the lockers. 11 metal doors, dented and unlabeled, lined the wall. I cracked the first open. A fedora, a trench coat I recognized as belonging to Murray Zellman, a courier who'd gone missing 3 weeks earlier. The next locker held a woman's tailored overcoat and a stack of case notes in handwriting I recognized from an operative I'd seen at the Gazette twice. 8 lockers, 8 lives interrupted. Saul's locker wasn't obvious, but the 9th door held a flat cap, identical to Saul's but too clean. A plant, a decoy. Someone wanted to confuse the timeline. I shut the door gently, my fingers curling into fists, but I held back. No time for reckless moves. 4 steps later, the air shifted. A faint iron smell. Blood. A small office stood at the far end, door barely ajar. I nudged it with my foot and stepped in. This room was different. No order, no precision, just violence. A chair knocked over, a lamp smashed, papers scattered like confetti after an angry parade. On the floor, a pocket knife lay snapped clean in half. Saul's knife. I crouched, picking it up carefully. The blade was broken at a sharp angle, the kind of break you get when a man tries to cut something binding him, or someone else. For 3 paragraphs, I wasn't in the wisecracking mood. Saul Panzer was the steadiest man I knew. His handwriting didn't shake, his stride didn't falter, and his voice didn't rise unless necessity demanded it. Someone had pushed him to a limit he shouldn't have had to reach. Blood droplets dotted the desk's edge, small, precise, telling. A fight, not an execution. A struggle, not surrender. Saul fought. Of course he did. I straightened slowly, jaw set. Behind me came a familiar grunt. Goodwin. Pearly Stebbins stood in the doorway, bulk-framed like a refrigerator that had grown arms. For once he wasn't glowering. His expression held something like, well, not sympathy, but the closest Pearly ever got. Kramer sent me, he said. Said if Greer's mixed up in this, you'd be too damn stubborn to stay home. I'm predictable, I said. It's a curse. He nodded toward the blood. Panzer? Yeah. I pocketed the broken knife. But he's alive. He has to be. There's no body. Pearly didn't disagree. High praise. Together we swept the warehouse. His flashlight beam cut across piles of forged ID cards, stacks of counterfeit courier tags, and more government seals than the US Mint would care to admit existed. But no Saul, no Greer, no captors, just clues. On a drafting table lay a map of Midtown, delivery routes traced in blue pencil, one route circled in red, twice, with a shaky hand. A note beside it read, Drop, high-rise, Midtown, 11 p.m. Greer was planning a major delivery of forged federal passes. That's tonight, I muttered. Pearly grunted. We'll hit it with backup. You'll hit it, I corrected. Wolfe needs the full picture first. Pearly gave me a look usually reserved for malfunctioning refrigerators, but he didn't argue. Tell Wolfe I'll wait for his call. That was Pearly's version of respect. I'd take it. Back at the brownstone by 12:15 p.m., Wolfe sat rigidly behind his desk, fingertips steepled, absorbing every detail I reported. Ink, lockers, Saul's knife, the circled delivery route. When I mentioned charging the high-rise, Wolfe snapped, not loudly, but with the sharpness of a man slicing through fear with logic. You will not risk your life until I've finished this thought, Mr. Goodwin. There it was, that Wolfe brand of protectiveness he disliked admitting to. He wrapped it in formal annoyance, but the core was worry. I leaned back. Fine. Think. Think fast. Before he could retort, the front doorbell rang. One long buzz. Fritz appeared in the office doorway moments later, face pale. Mr. Wolfe. Another letter. The room went still. Fritz handed it over. A plain envelope, same paper, same typing. Wolfe opened it. Inside was a photograph. Saul Panzer, bound to a chair, unconscious, bruised. A timestamp at the bottom. 10:22 a.m. 2 hours earlier. A fresh chill ran down my spine. They'd kept him alive, for now. Wolfe lifted the photograph gingerly, his face a controlled mask, but his knuckles whitened. Archie, he said softly. Yes? We must be flawless. And that's when I knew. The orchid-loving mountain had shifted. If Wolfe ever had doubts about letting the NYPD inside his strategic kitchen, he hid them well. At 7:42 p.m., our office looked like a war room run by a man who detested war. Wolfe sat behind his desk, maps spread out like a general's table of sins. Kramer stood beside me, arms crossed, chewing a cigar that had given up hope. Pearly Stebbins loomed by the door like a granite statue hired for intimidation. Wolfe tapped an index card. This building's courier traffic operates in cycles of 8 minutes. Mr. Goodwin, you will enter during the lull between dispatch rotations. I nodded, though I couldn't resist a jab. Sure, and while I'm strolling through hostile territory, perhaps you'd like me to recite poetry for morale. Archie, Wolfe said, your rashness is occasionally efficient. Do not let occasional become habitual. Kramer snorted. Goodwin's whole personality is habitual. Thank you, Inspector, I said sweetly. Your support warms me. Wolfe lifted a hand. Enough. The high-rise is designed for ostentation. You will not blend in among its regular visitors. Use the service hallway. Stebbins grunted approval. Less traffic, less security. And less charm, I said. But I'll make do. Wolfe's eyes fixed on me, dark, steady, with that rare flicker of protectiveness he always tried to pass off as annoyance. Mr. Goodwin, do not improvise unless absolutely necessary. That was Wolfe for Don't Die. I nodded. At 8:21 p.m. I slipped into the high-rise through a rear service corridor that had all the elegance of a neglected broom closet. The main lobby, visible through a glass pane, gleamed like a palace dripping with gold leaf and bad taste. Designed, I muttered, by someone who wanted visitors to feel poor. I moved down the hallway, past crates, laundry carts, and a bored guard scratching his ear. Flashing Saul's photo got me nothing at first, until a second guard ambled by, squinted and jolted upright. "Yeah," he said, "I saw that guy, the one in the picture." He jerked a thumb downward. He was with a tall fella in a grey suit. They went to the sub-basement. Something about a cart. "Thank you," I said. "You may have saved a man's life." He puffed up proudly, unaware he'd just helped commit unauthorized heroics. The elevator to the sub-basement rattled like it had been built before the invention of optimism. When the doors opened, the smell of ink rushed out, too familiar by now. Printing presses again, Greer's signature stench. I moved silently, or as silently as a man can when his adrenaline is doing tap dance routines in his veins. I found the room fast. Greer stood in the middle of a printing bay, sleeves rolled up, hair wild, eyes fever bright. Federal IDs, dozens, littered the tables around him. His alignment was sloppy. Saul would have torn it apart with one look. Speaking of Saul, he lay tied to a support beam, bruised, conscious but too weak to speak. "Greer," I said, stepping inside, hands loose at my sides, "you've got talent, but your printing alignment would offend even the dullest typesetter." His head snapped toward me. A revolver gleamed in his grip. "Don't move," he barked. "You think I don't know who you are?" "Sure you do," I said lightly. "But in case you need a reminder, I'm the guy who's about to ruin your night." He twitched, unstable, erratic. "I'm untouchable. I can be anyone. Any route, any badge, any identity. No one knows my real name." "Martin Greer," I said. That rattled him. His hand shook. "You don't know." "Oh, but we do. Peck sang, the florist sang, the mail drop woman sang an aria. And now I'm here to take back the man you borrowed." He aimed at my head. Saul stirred weakly. Greer moved to fire, and the door behind me exploded inward as Pearly Stebbins barreled in like a freight train fueled by justice and bad coffee. "Drop it!" Stebbins roared. Greer swung toward him, but Pearly's shoulder hit him like a demolition charge. The gun skittered across the floor. I dove, scooped it up, and trained it on Greer while Stebbins planted a knee on his back and wrenched his arms behind him. "Good timing," I said. Stebbins grunted. "Kramer's orders, you get lost too easy." I moved to Saul, untied him gently. He sagged forward, voice hoarse but alive. "Archie, your entrance needs work." "You're welcome," I said, not hiding the crack in my voice. "Let's get you out of here." Back at the brownstone at 9:56 p.m., Wolfe waited like a mountain deciding whether to be an avalanche. As I recounted the rescue, his face never changed, but his hands eased from fists to open palms on the desk. When I finished, he closed his eyes for a single second, relief disguised as contemplation. "So," I said, "now that we've got Greer—" "No," Wolfe cut in quietly. "We do not have him, not wholly, not all of him. The man is merely one gear in a contrivance. His counterfeiting ring is supported by clients, some of whom employed Mr. Panzer. They must be confronted together." Kramer, standing near the globe, nodded grimly. "Agreed. One at a time won't cut it." Wolfe inhaled deeply. "Then summon them. All of them. Peck, Marani, the mail drop woman, every operative whose identity Greer used, and every client whose work he touched." Kramer blinked. "All to your house?" "Yes," Wolfe said. "Tonight." I whistled low. "That'll be a circus." "Phooey," Wolfe muttered. "It will be a reckoning." And that's how Nero Wolfe declared war, from the comfort of his office chair. If Nero Wolfe ever chose to abandon detective work and rule a small European nation instead, he would have been frighteningly good at it. That thought crossed my mind at 10:30 p.m., when the brownstone office transformed into a courtroom presided over by one very immovable, very irritated dictatorship of one. Wolfe sat behind his desk like a thundercloud upholstered in leather. Saul Panzer, bandaged but upright, occupied the red chair. Kramer and Stebbins stood like bailiffs who'd been hired for muscle rather than charm. The suspects, Marani, Peck, the mail drop woman, and two operatives whose identities Greer had been borrowing, clustered on the couches with expressions ranging from terrified to insulted. My job? Arrange the seating, secure the doors, and look menacing enough to discourage escape. Being me, I added flourish. Ladies, gentlemen, counterfeiters, I announced, make yourselves comfortable. Wolfe will be with you shortly, unless he decides to throw you all out and solve this alone. Archie, Wolfe rumbled. Yes, sir, I said sweetly, and took my position by the globe. Wolfe surveyed the room, his gaze slow, cold, and surgical. This, he said, has been a most distasteful case, not merely for its crimes, but for its presumption. Someone believed they could manufacture an illusion so complete that even Mr. Panzer could be erased and replaced. Peck let out a pathetic whimper. Marani folded his polished hands. The mail-drop woman stared fixedly at her shoes. Wolfe continued, I will begin with the obvious. Mr. Greer. He nodded at Stebbins, who nudged Greer forward in handcuffs. Greer's eyes glittered with the jittery pride of a man who thinks genius excuses felony. Wolfe regarded him like one might regard a fungus on a prized orchid. Greer, Wolfe said, stole identities to move contraband and bypass scrutiny. He assumed investigators' names, their routes, their assignments. This enabled him to transport forged federal credentials unnoticed. But he was not the architect. He was a craftsman, skilled, unstable, and easily goaded. Greer snarled. You think you know? Silence, Wolfe commanded without raising his voice. The room obeyed. He shifted his attention to Peck. Mr. Peck, though not malicious, financed the counterfeit ring unintentionally by employing operatives Greer impersonated. That money kept the presses running, the bribes flowing, the kidnappings funded. Peck shook his head violently. I didn't know. I hired Saul to stop this. And you ran at the first sign of danger, I added helpfully. Peck sank lower. Wolfe moved on. Then we have Mr. Marani. The florist stiffened, his suave facade cracking like overstretched icing. Your role was not merely to provide flowers, Wolfe said. You supplied secure backrooms, soundproof spaces, and discreet courier routes. Your shop served as a hub, not for orchids, but for messages and exchanges requiring privacy. You knew your patrons. You knew their crimes. Marani opened his mouth, but Wolfe lifted a hand. The gesture froze him more effectively than a police warrant. Now, Wolfe said, we address the body. Peck winced. The room held its breath. The corpse discovered on 9th Avenue, Wolfe continued, resembled Mr. Panzer closely enough to deceive at a glance. That was intentional. It was a ploy to rattle me. Successful, I admit. His voice dropped an octave, fury tempered to ice. Whoever arranged it wanted me to pursue the wrong death while the true victim was being held alive. Saul's fingers tightened on the armrest. Wolfe saw it, softened a fraction, then pressed on. The letters, Wolfe said, a series of threatening notes designed to accelerate my actions. Their purpose was simple, to force haste, cloud judgment, and ensure I blundered into confusion. Kramer grunted. You? Blunder? Wolfe ignored him. And for the final insult, Wolfe said, the motive. Saul Panzer was to be replaced. Permanently. His skills, his reputation, his identity, stolen like a coat from a rack. A counterfeit Saul would infiltrate federal systems under the guise of trustworthiness. A ripple passed through the suspects. Greer smirked, confirming guilt without a word. But, Wolfe said, even the most intricate scheme has its flaw. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. The room leaned with him. The letters, he said, they were not produced on Greer's typewriter. Greer jerked. What? Wolfe allowed himself the smallest, most disdainful smile I'd ever seen him offer a crook. The typeface matched, but the mechanical defect did not. A subtle skipping of the uppercase M, caused by a misaligned striker arm. I recognized it from a receipt signed last month. He turned slowly, oh so slowly, toward Marani. The defect, Wolfe said softly, belongs to your typewriter. Marani froze. Not the theatrical stillness of a man preparing a lie. This was the stiff, brittle paralysis of someone whose secrets have been dragged into daylight and nailed to the wall. Wolfe didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Mr. Marani, he said, your typewriter created the letters intended to send me careening through this case like a cart without a wheel. You manipulated Mr. Greer, funded him indirectly through Peck's payments, and provided him with your soundproof room. You arranged the corpse decoy, and, he tapped the desk, you attempted to erase Saul Panzer. Marani's jaw twitched. You can't. This is circumstantial. Greer handled everything. Phooey, Wolfe said, the word delivered with all the finality of a judge's gavel. Greer lacks the discipline, the elegance, the foresight. You, however, run a florist shop that has functioned as a courier exchange for years. You understand schedules, patterns, disappearances. You have connections among discreet clientele and access to private spaces that no one questions. You are, in every practical sense, the conductor of this orchestra. Greer lunged half out of his chair. He told me what to do. He planned it all. He said Panzer was the only man who could expose us. Well, I said, leaning against the globe, Panzer sure exposed someone. Marani sputtered. This is outrageous. Peck told him everything. This whole room is biased. Wolfe reached for the bell cord. One sharp pull. Fritz appeared in under 10 seconds. A record. Fritz, Wolfe said calmly, please summon Inspector Kramer. Kramer lifted one eyebrow. I'm already here. Then arrest him, Wolfe said. Marani sprang up. No, listen, Greer forced me. He threatened. He said if I didn't cooperate. Inspector, Wolfe said over him, the man is lying with desperation, not skill. Proceed. Kramer stepped forward, slow and steady. Aldous Marani, you're under arrest for conspiracy, kidnapping, impersonation, obstruction, and whatever else the DA adds when he gets a look at this mess. Marani sagged. His perfect suit wrinkled. His perfect posture collapsed. The polished facade slid off like wet paint. Stebbins cuffed him, grunting, another one who thinks he's too smart for the law. Saul watched silently from the red chair, face pale but steady. When Marani was hauled out, Saul let out a breath that carried a month's worth of tension. Kramer turned to Wolfe, and for once, there was no growling, no jabs, no veiled threats. Just respect, gruff, reluctant, and genuine. You cracked it, Wolfe, he said quietly. Damn you, you cracked it. Wolfe inclined his head. It was necessary. And Panzer? Kramer asked. Wolfe gestured to Saul. Alive, thanks to Mr. Goodwin, and to your timely intervention. Kramer muttered something that might have been, or might have been the verbal equivalent of a handshake. Then he jerked his head at Stebbins, who dragged Greer out after Marani. The room, once crowded with tension, felt suddenly enormous. Saul shifted. Wolfe held up a hand. Spare me expressions of gratitude. I abhor them. That was almost sentimental, I said. Archie, Wolfe snapped. Silence. But he didn't mean it. Not really. Saul managed a faint smile. For what it's worth, I won't forget it. Wolfe inhaled deeply, an exhale rumbling like distant thunder. Your perseverance, Mr. Panzer, is admirable. Saul blinked. That was, in Wolfe speak, a standing ovation. Well, I said, all's well that ends with only one fake corpse. Saul chuckled. Archie, next time I take a vacation. You're not allowed vacations, I said. Every time you take one, people start counterfeiting you. Wolfe growled. Goodwin. Sorry, couldn't resist. Wolfe leaned back in his chair with the air of a man reclaiming his rightful throne. Gentlemen, enough. This has been an excessively taxing day. Fritz, bring beer. Fritz nodded and vanished. Saul looked at me. You saved my life, I shrugged. You owe me a hat, and Wolfe owes me a raise. Phooey, Wolfe said, but the corners of his mouth lifted, half an inch, no more. By Wolfe standards, that was a grin. Fritz returned with a tray of chilled beer, timed perfectly, as always. Wolfe took his glass with the dignity of a king accepting tribute. Saul eased back, wincing, but alive, and I exhaled a long breath that felt like dropping a 50-pound weight. Order returned, crime solved, orchids waiting upstairs, and Nero Wolfe, mountain tyrant genius, had just reminded the city why you never ever threatened Saul Panzer.